The Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery is located 6 miles west of downtown Columbus. The federal government purchased the site in 1879. This Confederate cemetery in Columbus's Hilltop neighborhood marks the place where, 140 years ago, a prisoner of war camp stood. At the time, the location was well outside the city limits. In May of 1861, a Union military training ground was established here under the name Camp Jackson. By July of that year, when the first prisoners were admitted, its name had been changed to honor President Lincoln's Secretary of State and later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Hamilton County native Salmon P. Chase. At first, Camp Chase took only officers as prisoners, with enlisted men going to Fort Warren near the Boston Harbor. A large number of officers came from 1862 Union victories at Fort Donelson, Tennessee, and Mississippi Island No. 10. In 1863, a new stockade was built on Johnson's Island in Lake Erie, and most of the Camp Chase officers were sent there. By 1863, there were 8,000 men incarcerated behind the high, staked walls of the camp. The camp served other functions while it housed captured rebel soldiers. Units were mustered into regiments there, and regiments that had finished their service were discharged. Union prisoner of wars released from Confederate prisons were processed through Camp Chase. Among the Ohio Volunteer Infantry's based there were 3 future presidents. Lieutenant Colonel James Garfield served in the 42nd OVI, the 20th President of the United States. Following a trip to Illinois to purchase muskets, Garfield returned to Ohio and in August 1861 received a commission as a colonel in the 42nd Ohio Infantry Regiment. The 42nd Ohio existed only on paper, so Garfield's first task was to fill its rank. He did so quickly, recruiting many of his neighbors and former students. The regiment traveled to Camp Chase to complete their training. Major Rutherford B. Hayes, the 19th President of the United States. He joined a volunteer company composed of his literary society friends. That June, Governor William Dennison appointed several of the officers of the volunteer company to positions in the 23rd Regiment of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry. Hayes was promoted to major. William McKinley, who was the 25th President of the United States. McKinley was the last president to have served in the American Civil War. He began as a private in the Union Army and ended as a brevet major. The camp as a whole occupied only about 6 acres of land between National Road, which is now Broad Street, and what is today Sullivan Avenue. Its eastern border was the current Hague Avenue. Many soldiers who died in the smallpox epidemic of 1863 due to overcrowding. The overcrowding forced 2 to 3 men to share a single occupancy bunk and led to severe shortages in food and medicine as well as clothing and blankets. The men were malnourished and cold, and therefore highly susceptible to the disease. In February of 1863 alone, 499 men died from smallpox. A cemetery was established at the camp near the end of 1863. The Confederate dead who had been buried in the city cemetery were moved back to Camp Chase. They were buried under cheap wooden markers in a plot surrounded by a low fence. When the war ended, most of the camp itself was dismantled. Some of the cabins where prisoner of wars had been housed were used as cheap shanties for a few years, but for the most part, every indication that the military base had been there was gone, except for the graveyard, which was left to deteriorate. It wasn't until 1895 that William Noss, a retired Union colonel who had been injured on the battlefield at Fredericksburg, found the graveyard and determined to restore it. He held memorial services there featuring speakers such as Governor Nash and drew crowds as big as 5,000 people by 1898. One by one, the soldiers received proper stone monuments instead of the wooden slats. Their regiments and states of origin were carved beneath their names. A new wall was built to enclose the cemetery, and the signature memorial arch, completed with a statue of a rebel soldier, was unveiled on June 7, 1902. The boulder underneath reads 2,260 Confederate soldiers of the war 1861 through 1865 buried in this enclosure. But the sentiment carved across the arch is one word long: Americans.